getting this into the correct form. Okay, we're off and running. So, this is Aaron Rosari, your fearless leader, recording the first official video presentation. I know, it's exciting. So far, you all have been navigating the course quite well. If you have any questions, keep emailing them or posting them on discussion board number 1. If upon hearing this lecture, which basically replaces class discussion, you're still unclear as to the content, don't get behind. Email me. We can even set up a phone call if necessary to further work through the material. If you're local, you can always stop in during office hours, which are posted on the syllabus. That's a great option, actually. Okay. So, the purpose of this lecture is simply to review reading questions set number 1. So this more or less replaces a class lecture, and upon viewing this, you should proceed to discussion board number 3. And if you don't have much trouble hammering out that initial post of 150 to 300 words, that's a good sign. You're tracking, you're doing well. Okay, now, our first topic is the nature of ethical norms. And our focus is how moral theories are built, what the data is, and basically the data is the most obvious of the moral truths out there. And we're just going to walk through some of this and explain it and hopefully bring some clarity. Okay, so let's start from the ground up. A statement, so we're going to discuss here descriptive versus normative statements, and this corresponds to question number 1. A statement is any sentence which can be true or false. So in the English language, that's pretty much the declarative statements. So if I were to say I'm watching a video or I'm preparing a video lecture right now, that would be a statement because we can evaluate it for truth or falsity. Similarly, if I claim, just take a moral one real quick, moral statement, torturing small children for fun is wrong. That's also a statement. We can evaluate that for truth and falsity. Now, we have 2 basic types of statement, broad types, statements that merely attempt to describe the world as it is are descriptive, and statements which make evaluations or say how things ought to be, those are the normative statements. Alright, so let's look at questions 1A and B. These concern the descriptive statements. I've tried to build in some helpful redundancy. So again, a descriptive statement is a statement which attempts to merely describe what the world is like. Here are some examples. All molecules are composed of atoms, and this one is true. Our second example, some unicorns live in Tanzania. Well, that one actually comes out false. And this third one, I'm not sure if anyone knows yet. So general relativity is compatible with quantum mechanics. That might be true, might be false. And I've put examples of descriptive statements, one that's true, one that's false, one that's unknown, just to capture this definition. So remember, they're statements which attempt to describe what the world is like. And again, in the case of a false statement, descriptive statement, the attempt fails. In the case of a true descriptive statement, the attempt succeeds. And this third example down here is just here to show we don't always know if the statement fails or succeeds. But nonetheless, these are all descriptive statements because they're attempting to describe what the world is like. Now, let's take a closer look at the normative statements. These are statements which make evaluations or say how things ought to be. 3 examples. The sunset was especially beautiful tonight. And that is a normative statement, but it's an aesthetic norm. It's judging the appearance of the sky. Second example, you are irrational if you do not believe that the planet is warming up. This is also a normative statement dealing with a norm of rationality. The purpose of norms of rationality are to guide us toward true belief and guide us away from false belief. So the claim here is that the evidence is strong enough now that it's irrational not to believe this. Third example, the Ku Klux Klan are an evil bunch of cowards, and this is an expression of a moral norm. Norms of rationality evaluate behavior. Norms of rationality evaluate our beliefs and belief-forming processes. Norms of morality, on the other hand, look at the second thing right here. The purpose of making moral statements is to evaluate someone's behavior. And slightly broader than that, so the attitudes which lead to behavior, or the behavior of entire institutions or groups. Okay, so as we saw on the prior slide, moral statements are one of many types of normative statement, and this is their specific focus. Okay, so as we transition into question 2, what we're doing is we're describing moral theorizing, the development of moral theories, the systematizing of our moral judgments in order to bring more clarity. We're comparing that to scientific theorizing as a kind of analogy to shed light on how it works. Okay, so scientific theories are descriptive, or by that I mean they're explaining descriptive facts, just how the world is. Hence, it is easy to explain how scientific theorizing proceeds. And this is a little naive. Scientific theorizing can be rather complex, but it's easy in the sense that we know it's easy to capture what the data is and kind of move on from there. So first, observations of the world are made and significant patterns are detected. Then, explanations of the pattern are proposed. And the explanations tend to be causal in nature. We want to know why the phenomenon has occurred, why the observations have been made, that sort of thing. But the observations themselves are pretty straightforward. You're looking at the world to see how it behaves. And that leads us to our third point here. Our focus here is that the basic data is observational, and what we seek is an explanation of why an observed pattern has occurred. Now, let's compare this with moral theorizing. Moral theories are normative, hence it is a little more difficult to grasp how moral theorizing proceeds. How does one evaluate how the world should be? What provides data for that? So again, if you're just trying to account for how the world is, you can experience how the world is directly. How does one go about saying how it ought to be? Okay, well first, instead of using simple observations as data, ethical theorists use our most obvious and non-controversial moral judgments as the data. Hence, it is our responses to what happens in the world that serves as the basic data. So if you see a person bullying another, and you think your conscience kind of acts up, and you form the judgment, oh, that's wrong. It's your response to what you're seeing that becomes the data, the sense that the action is wrong. And once you have a lot of data points, a lot of different responses to a lot of different scenarios, we get to this second point here. Second, the ethical theorists attempt to explain our patterns of moral judgment and explain what purpose these judgments serve. So if we can find patterns in the data, then they're not arbitrary. And which this implies they're serving a function. And as long as that's an important function, we need to pay attention to morality. That accounts for the forcefulness of our moral norms. Okay, now, ethical theories and moral data. So having given that basic description, let's look at some examples of moral data, and then we'll look at how 3 distinct theories emerge from this data by detecting patterns in it. So here's 6 obviously true moral judgments. Genocide is wrong. It is almost always wrong to steal. Adultery is wrong. It is almost always wrong to lie. Racist and sexist behaviors are unethical. Punching others on the street in the face is wrong. Okay, so not terribly controversial. Okay, now again we're going to look at 3 theories and how they account for this data. So, question 3b, how would the utilitarian account for this according to this first lecture? Now each of these theories I'm going to mention here, each of the 3 gets its own unit in the course, so you get a lot more elaboration later, a lot deeper understanding of how they operate. So the focus of utilitarian theorizing is on the consequences of our actions. An action with overwhelmingly bad consequences for those affected is an obvious wrong. So all 6 examples involve behaviors that are always or usually harmful. So let's go back. So remember, we wanted 6 obviously true moral judgments. The utilitarians focused on the consequences of actions. So if you look at the first, the third, the fourth, and the fifth, these are just clearly harmful to the victims. So that's a pattern clearly detected. And then if we look at it's almost always wrong to steal, well, the utilitarian would say because stealing is almost always harmful, but not always. So if you're at a bar with your friend and he or she wants to drive home, and the easiest way to prevent them from doing so is to kind of steal their keys for a while, hide them in your pocket. Oh, don't know where they went. Then that's fine. That's morally acceptable, maybe even morally obligatory because of the harm prevented. And similar thoughts about lying. Occasionally, lying, such as telling what we call a white lie, prevents harm instead of causes it. So by focusing on consequences, the utilitarian can give us an account of why these 6 actions are obvious wrongs. Okay, or types of action. Now, other theories focus on different dimensions of an action. So the virtue ethicist is focused on the character of the person performing an action. So a right action, according to someone like Aristotle, who's in the virtue tradition, is one that a person with good character traits would do. And we can define the good character traits, the morally good character traits, as those that promote flourishing in a societal context. And these are called virtues. And you're familiar with the moral virtues, things like patience, compassion, bravery, acting in a just or fair manner, and they have a clear social application, and that's what unifies them as the moral virtues. Similarly, look at the second point, a wrong action is one that a person with bad character traits, and bad being defined as antisocial, would do. So these negative traits are called vices. All 6 of our wrong actions are typically selfishly motivated and lead to suffering in a social context. So again, there's some overlap with the utilitarian. They're both focused on the fact that these behaviors result in harm, but the virtue ethicist takes it back a step and looks at the motivation behind the behavior, the sort of person that engages in these behaviors, and puts their focus there. But yeah, another detectable pattern, hence another theory of ethics that emerges from the data. Let me go back. All right, now, Immanuel Kant and John Rawls, and once again, we'll investigate these thinkers in depth throughout the semester. They emphasize the importance of being fair to the individual, respecting her rights, not violating her freedom or autonomy, And this also accounts for the data. All of these actions involve taking advantage of others for one's own gain, ignoring their well-being, being unfair to them, violating rights, and that's the Kantian Rawlsian tradition. Okay, now, just a quick recap. What the theories all agree on are the obvious wrongs and obvious rights, but they will diverge on less obvious wrongs and less obvious rights. So often you could take a moral principle. So you have your core moral data. You can get a bunch of different principles that account for the data. And then when you extend to the non-obvious cases, the principles will often dictate different courses of action. And that's one source of moral disagreement. But in our lecture, we actually focused on another. Okay, so this leads us to question 4, explaining moral disagreements. Now, the mere fact that disagreements are widespread in an area of investigation is not good evidence that there are no right and wrong answers in that area. Theoretical sciences, such as physics, experience rampant disagreement, and everyone agrees that physicists produce theories which can be evaluated as either true or false. So we shouldn't worry too much about moral disagreement in the sense that it doesn't imply, widespread moral disagreement does not imply that there are no right and wrong answers in ethics. Maybe it implies that those answers are often hard to discover. That's clearly the case. Perhaps sometimes more than one action is morally permissible. That also happens. But we can also pinpoint another source of moral disagreement or cause of moral disagreement. Not all moral disagreements, so look at this main point here, involve disagreements over which moral principle is correct. We can illustrate this with the pro-life, pro-choice debate. Consider the following moral principle. All human persons have a right to life. So this grounds prohibitions against things like murder, for example. Now, look at this piece of morally relevant information. The fetus either is or is not a human person. At a stage of fetal development, I left it blank, whatever stage you're focusing on. The initial stages, the middle stages, the late stages of a pregnancy. So there's considerable debate over whether or not the fetus is a human at the earliest stages. Maybe it's just a potential human. And another way to cash out that debate is to say, well, maybe it is human all the way through, but it's the human persons who have rights, and maybe it's not a human person yet. So these are two ways of kind of proceeding in this discussion. But the only point I'm making here is moral disagreements often do not occur at the level of moral principle. There's often a lot of morally relevant information which is disagreed upon, and that's actually causing the disagreement of what to do in that specific instance. Republicans and Democrats on taxation is another good example. They might both agree that the right policy is the one that produces the most economic benefit and causes people in the culture to flourish the most. But then they're going to have an empirical disagreement over which level actually does that. So once again, they can agree on the principle, but disagree on the morally relevant information. And I just added in another example here, based on question 4C. Take the following sexist idea. Women should be excluded from participating in the workplace. Now, look at the following plausible moral principle. Societies should run on principles which ensure that children flourish. Someone who wants to exclude women from the marketplace might attempt to do it based on this principle. How might they try and do that? Well, look at this morally relevant information. They might claim that children raised by stay-at-home moms are more likely to do well in life than children raised in families where both parents work. Similarly, the person who's arguing that women ought not to be excluded, at least women who are married and have kids, or just women who have kids for that matter, they could argue that it's just not the case, that children raised by stay-at-home moms are likely to do better in life than children who are not. Now, I haven't read a ton of this data, but my impression is that there is no direct correlation between children raised by stay-at-home moms and later successes in life and emotional stability and that sort of thing. But notice what I'm focusing on is the morally relevant information, not so much questioning this moral principle. Although one could, of course, question the principle by pointing out there's other principles that carry a lot of weight as well, which are relevant to the discussion. But once again, we're just illustrating that a source of moral disagreement isn't necessarily disagreement about moral principles, even though those disagreements occur. It can also be about morally relevant information. And there's two conclusions that can be drawn from this. One, this warrants a certain level of optimism. So if you already agree with someone on on the relevant moral principle, then there's often data to look at in order to figure out what the right thing to do is in the situation. So, for example, another example, take the debate over the death penalty. Well, we have data on whether or not states with the death penalty, if that's an effective deterrent in that state in comparison to similar crimes committed in states without the death penalty. I don't want to cloud the issue, so I'm not going to say what the data indicates, but that's an issue that's arguably pretty resolvable right now just by looking at the data. Now, the second output or second conclusion we can draw is that we should expect widespread moral disagreement because there's many sources of that disagreement, and we just highlighted two. And then a moment ago, we highlighted a third. There are different moral theories that can account for even the things we agree are wrong, and those theories will indicate different courses of action or prescribe different courses of action in the more gray cases. Okay, so if you have a basic understanding of what the moral data is, how we get the theories from the data, and have a grasp of some of these sources of moral disagreement, you've certainly done your job for today. Okay, proceed to discussion board 3, and we'll go from there.